As we were talking about risk, this is basically how the transaction is processed. The card holder will go in with their money to the business owner and run the transaction, whatever that denomination is. That transaction then goes to the bank card group. The bank card group then sends that to Visa and MasterCard. Visa and MasterCard then send that to the issuing processor. The issuing processor then sends that transaction to the card issuer. The card issuer would be the bank in this scenario that issued the credit card to the card holder. In this scenario, we're going to simply say that it's a $100 transaction, relatively a low-risk transaction. The transaction goes through this process and gets back to the card issuer. Once the card holder receives their bill, they can do what's called a chargeback. They can say that I did not make that purchase was unsatisfactory to me, or that they simply changed their mind and the business owner would not do the return. In that scenario, what takes place is you basically have a line dividing between the card holder and the merchant. When the card holder begins a dispute with the issuer, they basically call the bank that issued them the credit card. The bank will then send that transaction back through Visa and MasterCard and back to the bank card group. It's our responsibility as the bank card group to get the proper documentation from the business owner and what is required. The signed invoice, the signed receipt, whatever the case may be that the card issuer is requesting. We will then send that information back to the card issuer. Ultimately, the card issuer will make the decision as to who is in the right or in the wrong in this transaction. If they side with the card holder will get their money back on their credit card. The card issuer will then tell the bank card group that they have sided with the card holder, at which time we have to go back to the merchant. To really understand risk and why the bank card group is involved is, let's say that this was a $10,000 transaction. The same process takes place, but after the card holder disputes this transaction, and let's say they go through the proper documentation, but the merchant fails to provide a signed receipt or proof that that transaction took place. The card issuer obviously is going to side with the card holder. They notify the bank card group that they have sided with the card holder, and the bank card group is now responsible to go back to the business owner and get that money. Well, what happens if we go back to the bank of the business owner and there are zero funds inside of that merchant? What happens in that place is we are still responsible for that money. So the bank card group will be responsible to repay the $10,000 back to the card issuer, who then in return give that $10,000 back to the card holder. Ultimately, ultimately you need to understand that the card issuer is going to make the ultimate decision. We are on the side of the merchant, and the card issuer is on the side of the card holder. If in fact the merchant does prove that the transaction took place, the card holder would be responsible for those funds. If the card holder simply decides to not pay their bill, the card issuer would be on the hook for that same $10,000. Hopefully through this diagram you understand a little bit more about the risk process. For further questions, talk to your sales manager.